And nice to have you with us. We continue talking about some of the issues that perhaps are not at the forefront of our minds this festive season, but are just as important nonetheless. So you'll have a head start. By the time people talk about it in January, you'll say, I already saw it on Morning Live, right? So let's get straight into this particular issue. More than 190 countries have come together to adopt the most ambitious climate change agreement in history. That was during the 21st Conference of the Parties in Paris, France. This agreement establishes a long-term and durable global framework to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions for sustainable healthcare. South African Medical Association chairperson Dr Mzukisi Grootboom joins us now from our Durban studios to tell us a little bit more about that agreement and what exactly it means to South Africa and South Africans in general. Doc, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, Ayanda. Good morning to your viewers.
Before we get ahead of ourselves,
having me.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you so much for availing yourself. You know, in December, none of our guests want to come through, so we get particularly excited when anybody avails themselves. Thank you for coming. Doc, let's go straight into the issues now. And before we get carried away, perhaps we can start by reminding ourselves about that decision that was taken at COP21 and what was achieved at that conference.
The importance of that agreement is really, the first important thing is that 195 countries have adopted a resolution which is not only binding, it's also legally binding from the point of view that they put health and sustainability of our planet on the top of the agenda in actually committing themselves to limiting carbon emissions and reducing climate change by less than 2% going forward by 2020.
One might wonder what the relation is between climate change and the medical fraternity. But SAMA has already warned of inevitable increases in diseases such as malaria, in cholera, and a host of others as a result of climate change. Speak to us about that symbiotic relationship between the two areas.
The relationship relates precisely to the fact that with every rise in temperature, we have unusual climate experience in that we get severe heat, we get flooding, we get drought conditions, we get crop failures, we have limitation in food and nutrition. It affects particularly those areas that are vulnerable. We're talking here in particular about sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of Southeast Asia. So it's the poorest of the poor that are affected by this. And also, you might remember that we, in the region where there is a lot of infections, lot of waterborne infections, talking here about malaria, bilharzia, dengue, and so forth, including typhoid fever.
Have we started to see the manifestations of those increases in parts? Are there any telltale signs that we're headed in that direction?
We have indeed, and there's an increased observation from our side in terms of the increasing burden of disease. And we might have thought in the last 10 years that some of these diseases we've been able to eliminate them. But little did we know that the effects of climate change and increasing carbon emissions are going to actually reverse all the gains we've made in the last 50 years.
What can be done about this? Because as you mentioned, the poorest of the poor are the ones who will be affected. And oftentimes our governments have got very little weight in these discussions on what needs to happen on a global scale. So perhaps my question is rather broad. As ordinary citizens, as government, as leadership, as people in general, what do we do about this?
In fact, the most important thing, particularly with regards to what we've achieved on the 12th of December in Paris, with South Africa being involved, is that we need governments around the world to live up to what they had promised us. And it should be a constant agenda item in our discussions to actually hold governments up to what they promised in terms of the mitigation and the amelioration of the effects of climate change by us moving away from fossil fuels and gradually adopting renewable energy in terms of supply of energy in our, in our areas. The other thing is that it might look insignificant in terms of the usage of electricity, the cars we drive, and the amount of water that we use. All those small things, even in your own home, a simple thing like plugging a cell phone charger the whole day without being in use. We are tapping on the grid, and it actually forces companies like Eskom to use more of the coal to power that. We need to really think about what we do just as ordinary citizens. Besides forcing our governments in our own way, in our own homes, in our own villages, in our own towns, we need to be cognizant of why, how big our carbon footprint is. I mean, a lot of people in South Africa use their own cars. Each one of us drives a car home. We should seriously think about increasing public transport, use trains, use buses, and even in terms of gains that we can get from that, and actually stop using cars and start cycling to work and walking to work and that kind of thing.
And lift clubs as well. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, I wonder if my colleagues Azwi, Leanne, Valen would agree on a pool club, but I think then would ask who's going to be driving and who's going to be napping in the car. But back to the topic at hand, you've spoken about the burden of disease, but let's touch on the poor nutrition. I mean, in South Africa, we're experiencing drought in parts of the country as well. That no doubt will affect the general health and well-being of South Africans.
It will indeed, because if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, I was in Zambia about two months ago as part of my involvement in the South African Medical Association. The drought effects across the sub-Saharan Africa, are actually becoming very, very serious, and food shortages and that kind of thing. It's actually very strange that any nation should not be able to produce enough food for its own citizens to be able to maintain themselves. And you must have heard recently that South Africa has decided to import maize. I mean, we've actually taken it for granted that we are able to grow enough maize to feed our people. But I'm told next year we'll have to import some of these. These are some of the little things that are happening that affect us because of the drought situation we're beginning to experience in the last few years.
Doc, we'll have to leave it there, at least for now. Thank you so much for your input and your great insight. South African Medical Association chairperson, Dr Mzukisi Grootboom. It's been a pleasure joining us live from our Durban studios. These erratic weather conditions, I mean, we have the El Nino effect in parts of the globe there, severe flooding and downpours and rain, and then droughts in other parts as well. And someone who will know all too well what's happening in that situation is Azwi, standing by with the latest weather.